Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, reporting from just outside the Palace of Westminster in central London, where global power, policy and markets intersect. Coming up on today's show, Anne Widdecombe, veteran politician and former MEP, killed in what counter-terrorism police are calling a targeted attack. A 28-year-old man is in custody, and incoming Prime Minister Andy Burnham says politics has darkened, and 349 Labour MPs have now nominated Andy Burnham, making it mathematically impossible for any other rival to stand. He becomes Prime Minister on Monday. What does Burnhamism mean for Britain? I speak with Dr. Charlotte Wildman of the University of Manchester. Then later, 46 children and several teachers abducted from 3 schools in Oyo State by suspected Answeru militants have been rescued. One teacher died in captivity. No ransom was paid. Nigeria's security forces say the operation was intelligence-led and decisive, but school abductions in Nigeria are becoming a recurring crisis. I speak with security analyst Dr. Freedom Onuoha. But first, this week, a man suspected of killing his wife and 2 daughters at a luxury Bedfordshire mansion appeared before a court in Johannesburg as South Africa formally begins extradition proceedings to return him to the United Kingdom. Ndodana Mkanyisi Tushuma, also known as Mark, a 45-year-old British citizen of Zimbabwean heritage, appeared at the Johannesburg Magistrates Court on Monday. He was calm during proceedings, with bloodshot eyes, surrounded by family members who declined to speak to the media. The matter was postponed to the 22nd of July to allow South African authorities to verify his immigration status and progress the extradition request received from the UK through Interpol. South African Justice Minister Mameloko Kumbayi has confirmed he will be extradited to Britain to face justice. British prosecutors have authorised 3 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of his wife, Notable Zandile Tushuma, aged 42, and their daughters, Natalie, 15, and Nala, just 5 years old. Their bodies were discovered on the 6th of July when police forced entry into their family home in Great Denham near Bedford, after reports the family had not been seen for several days. A post-mortem examination has confirmed the cause of death as blunt force trauma. Tushuma is believed to have flown from Heathrow on the 5th of July, the day before the bodies were found, on his British passport. British authorities failed to flag him before departure, a lapse that has drawn significant scrutiny. He travelled via Dubai to South Africa and is also believed to have briefly entered Zimbabwe. He was arrested in the Kensington suburb of Johannesburg on Friday in a joint operation between South African police and Interpol, and was found in possession of an unlicensed 9mm firearm, a separate charge that must be resolved before extradition can proceed. South Africa's acting National Police Commissioner was direct. This arrest demonstrates that South Africa is not a safe haven for fugitives, she said. Natalie was described by her school as a pupil full of life who had a positive impact on everyone. Nala was 5 years old, their mother 42. And from one devastating crime to another that has shaken the foundations of British political life. Anne Widdecombe, veteran Conservative MP, former prisons minister, MEP for the Brexit Party, and most recently a spokeswoman for Reform UK, was found dead at her remote bungalow in Haytor on Dartmoor, Devon, on Thursday the 10th of July. She was 78 years old. Police believe she was attacked the previous day, Wednesday the 9th of July, at approximately 12:30 lunchtime. What makes her final hours particularly haunting is this. At 12:10 on that Wednesday, just 20 minutes before police believe she was killed, Widdecombe gave an interview to Christian radio station TWR, defending Nigel Farage over parliamentary investigations into his finances, describing the Commons Standard Committee as a game of personal destructions. Messages between Widdecombe and a television producer show she abruptly stopped responding shortly before the suspected time of the attack. A 28-year-old man was arrested in South Yorkshire, more than 200 miles from her home, and was initially held on suspicion of murder. He was subsequently rearrested by counter-terrorism police on suspicion of the commission, preparation or instigation of acts of terrorism. He remains in custody. Counter-terrorism police are now investigating whether the suspect was motivated by left-wing extremism and whether he had intended to target other high-profile figures, particularly those associated with Reform UK. Head of National Counter-Terrorism Policing Lawrence Taylor said it was clear this was a targeted attack. We are still working to understand the extent of any planning or preparation and the motivation that sits behind it, he said. Nigel Farage said Reform UK staff had searched party emails for patterns of abuse directed at Widdecombe but found nothing. He and other senior Reform figures have since raised concerns about their own security levels, with claims that Farage's state-funded police protection had been downgraded. Incoming Prime Minister Andy Burnham called for a serious review of MP security. He said Widdecombe's murder followed those of Sir David Amess and Joe Cox, and that politics had darkened since he was last in Westminster. Cabinet Minister Lucy Rigby described an horrific and escalating culture of violence and intimidation directed at public figures, one that is discouraging people, particularly women, from entering political life. And amid the grief and shock of this week, the machinery of British politics continues to turn. 349 Labour MPs have now nominated Andy Burnham, making it mathematically impossible for any rival to enter the race. He is set to become Prime Minister on Monday, the 20th of July, Britain's 7th Prime Minister in a decade. His cabinet is already taking shape. Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, who impressed many with her handling of the immigration crisis, is widely expected to be named Chancellor after Burnham's inner circle objected to his original choice, Energy Secretary Ed Miliband. The Financial Times has confirmed Mahmood's appointment. She is seen as someone who will keep the markets calm. She is considerably more to the right of the party than Miliband, a deliberate signal to investors and to the bond markets. Ed Miliband is now tipped for the Foreign Office. Rachel Reeves will leave the Treasury. On Trump, Burnham has already staked out his position. Speaking to Gary Lineker this week, he said he would not be afraid to disagree with the US president, but would do so by meeting him where he's at. Trump described Manchester as some town when referring to Burnham's position. Burnham said that will not have gone down fantastically well in the city I used to represent. For the millions of Nigerians and Africans living across Britain, a new Prime Minister, a new cabinet and a new political era begins on Monday. The question is whether Burnhamism can deliver what it promises. I've been speaking with Dr. Charlotte Wildman, historian of politics and society at the University of Manchester.
This language around, a more inclusive language, a more kind of optimism, and a language around optimism and hope and bringing people together will be really powerful. And I think one of Andy Burnham's skills is changing the narrative. And he did this in Manchester very, very successfully. And I think we will see this really strong shift away from the focus on broken Britain, on divisions, to a more kind of progressive, hopeful language of togetherness. However, that does need to be backed up by a real tangible change in people's lives. And I think the pressure will be on to demonstrate an improvement in living standards. We know the cost of living has hit Britain's, right across Britain, it's hit people really hard. So we will need to see a demonstrable change, and people will need to feel that their lives have got better very quickly, I think. Absolutely. He's a brilliant communicator. And I think he's very skilled at listening to people and understanding the real issues that are behind, people's concerns and worries, and has a very kind of clever way of connecting with voters that is unpretentious, that, crosses different kinds of social groups. And I think kind of focuses on tangible things that make lives better. So I think one of the big successes of Manchester has been the improvements, particularly to the bus service. And that has, made life so much easier for people. And I think that kind of example goes a long way to helping people feel listened to and feel that the things can make a difference to their everyday lives do happen. I think Burnham's going to try so hard to do this. I think what we will see is some innovation, particularly around tax and economic policy. I mean, Burnham's been very clear that, he's stressed that he's against crude cuts to welfare. He's going to stick to existing borrowing rules. But what we have seen in Manchester is some innovation, such as the tourist tax, And that's been really successful in bringing additional money that has been ploughed back into communities, particularly for things like street cleaning and so on. So I do think that we will see those kinds of creative ways of generating income on a national level to help fund these very ambitious plans around devolution, house building, and so on. So that will be the pressure of how to deliver these ambitious and important plans, but in a way that doesn't bring additional costs to taxpayers. So that's a really good question, and this will be used by opposing parties to question Burnham's power, and we've seen that quite a lot. It's a very, very effective way of trying to chip away at public confidence in the ruling party and Prime Minister. However, the Prime Minister is never actually directly elected by the British public, and it's our political system that asks elected MPs to make that decision for us. And so we have seen this historically, and some of our most famous Prime Ministers of the 20th century were unelected. So Winston Churchill, 1940, Harold Macmillan in 1957, James Callaghan in 1976. So some of our best known Prime Ministers came to power through, not dissimilar practices and kind of systems. So I think this will be an interesting area to watch, Burnham. I think I think we will see less divisive language around immigration and a shift away from blaming immigration for the social problems that Burnham will be grappling with. As Mayor of Manchester, Burnham spoke very proudly about Manchester as a diverse, multicultural city. At the same time, we know that immigration will remain on the political agenda and is an issue that voters will want Burnham to deal with. And he's already signalled his support for Labour's controversial asylum bill that aims to reduce the number of people crossing the channel, and also wants to kind of tighten some of the European regulations to limit the amount of successful asylum appeals. At the same time, as Mayor of Manchester, Burnham was also very critical of the impact of immigration policy causing wider social problems, particularly homelessness, and the way that immigration regulation restricted the ability of people seeking asylum to access public funds. So he was quite critical of that existing legislation as mayor. So I think that might be something he looks at as well.
And while Britain prepares for a new Prime Minister, on the other side of the world, a conflict that has shaped the global economy all year has entered a dangerous new phase. The June ceasefire between the United States and Iran has all but collapsed. For 5 consecutive days this week, the United States has launched waves of airstrikes on Iran, targeting coastal defense systems, cruise missile storage and launch sites and military positions near the Strait of Hormuz. The latest strikes, launched in broad daylight on Wednesday, hit Greater Tum Island in the strait itself, the 5th straight day of US attacks. Iran has retaliated. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched missiles at US military facilities in Kuwait, Jordan and Bahrain, with the US Navy's 5th Fleet in Bahrain among the targets. Both sides are largely limiting attacks to military assets, but the risk of escalation is real and growing. President Trump has pledged to intensify the bombardment until Tehran stops attacking commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz and agrees to open the waterway. But, as The Guardian noted this week, 5 months of U-turns and false boasts have left Trump in a worse position than when he started. Oil has risen for the 3rd consecutive day, with Brent jumping above $85 a barrel. Analysts warn prices could push towards $90, potentially triggering a fresh wave of inflation across economies that were only just beginning to recover from the first Hormuz shock. For Africa, this is not a distant geopolitical drama. It is fuel prices, it's food costs, it's squeezed government budgets. The continent has been here before this year, and the recovery from the first shock was incomplete. A second is now underway. Still to come on Channel's Business Global, Nigeria's security forces rescue 46 children from Answeru militants in Oyo State. One teacher died in captivity. No ransom was paid. I speak with security analyst Dr. Freedom Onuoha. And the African Economic Global Convergence brings its flagship London summit to Westminster in September. I speak with founder and convener Makeva Tomofe. All of this after the break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, reporting from just outside the Palace of Westminster in central London, where global power, policy and markets intersect. This week, Nigeria got the news it had been waiting 56 days to hear. The 46 pupils and teachers abducted from schools in Oyo State on the 15th of May have finally been rescued. President Tinubu announced the operation on Friday, military, police and intelligence driven. Several militants killed, 8 arrested, but one teacher was murdered in captivity before help arrived. The rescue is welcome, but it does not answer the harder question. Why is this happening in southwest Nigeria at all? The southwest has long been considered one of the country's safest regions. That is no longer something that can be taken for granted. And for every family celebrating this week, there are others across Nigeria still waiting for news of loved ones who have not yet come home. I've been speaking with Dr. Freedom Onuoha, security analyst and senior research fellow at the Africa Center for Strategic Research and Studies.
The recent successful rescue of the Oyo abducted pupils and teachers have really, demonstrated that Nigeria's security and kinetic capability has actually grown beyond the normal standard we used to know before. Most times we've seen that when you have such a high level of mass abduction, our response rate has been very slow. The capacity to rescue has actually not been there. But with this development, we can now see that the capacity for the Nigerian security forces to undertake a multi-stakeholder, a robust and intelligence-led operation that actually denied those terrorists the opportunity to flee with those children, and more importantly, put tremendous pressure on them that enabled them to be rescued safely is something worth celebrating. And I think to a very large extent, it clearly underscored the fact that over time, maybe because of partnership we have now seen grown, for example, with the United States security forces, maybe with sharing of intelligence and other assets that are key to successful operation. I think for the very first time, we can now see that the Nigerian security forces have really acted with other local security actors like Vigilante to operate at a very highly denied enemy territory. If you understand the nature of the Oyo National Park, it's quite a highly forested area, with a very thick vegetation, which will make it even very difficult for you to have such a successful kinetic rescue. So for them to have taken, what I may call off-the-shelf approach, to be able to bring pressure on them and then successfully rescue those children clearly point to the fact that we are now seeing at least an uptick in terms of the intelligence capability and operational capability of Nigerian state security forces. I think it's more or less an additional point to the fact that over the years we have now seen, gradual but consistent dispersal of the terrorism landscape. So those of us who spend a lot of time, studying terrorism, we call it, the expansion of the jihadist sphere, which is actually this geographical space where jihadist group in particular tend to operate. Like you did point out, in the last 10 years, I think we have seen much of the geographic concentration in the Northeast, particularly because that's where the Boko Haram has actually hibernated for a very long time. But you must also understand that it's not just a deliberate attempt to expand. I think a lot of factors are behind its expansion. First is the internal fracturing of the Boko Haram, which of course led to the emergence of the Answeru in 2012. And then with tremendous pressure being brought about some of these groups, particularly the responses we are having from the Nigerian security forces, the multinational joint task force, as well as the recent partnership we have seen with the United States. A lot of pressures are already on these groups. And so they are seeking out more open, safe sanctuaries, where we call liminal boundaries. Liminal boundaries are actually boundaries where you have limited state security presence, for example, border corridors, forested region. But in the case of Oyo, I think it's not just about the expansion. I think it's strategic. I think that the group wanted, to conduct an attack in a place that it considered to be relatively high level of success. Yes, I think to be held captive is not an experience anybody will wish for himself or for the loved one. And to have little kids, abruptly separated from their families and parents for over 40 days, I think it's the worst traumatic experience they must have endured in their life. So I think that the problem and the cost, the human cost, goes even beyond the period of captivity. It's something that is going to reverberate for many years to come. I can assure you that these children are going to, suffer a long period of trauma. Some of them, particularly very mature ones, like those teachers, may likely suffer post-traumatic stress disorder. They may not likely want to see themselves in such, environment. Some of the days this thing happened, for example, if it happened on Tuesday, will be something that will stuck in their memory. Some of them, again, they hear the kind of sound that preceded such attack, can actually generate a whole lot of deep feelings and depression in them. So it is just beyond, the cost is even beyond the days of captivity. It talks about, the prolonged years of trauma, the prolonged years of depression and post-traumatic stress disorder that follow. But let us also emphasize the fact that it is even beyond those children. For every person that is abducted, there are several other persons that will suffer the depression, their parents, their brothers, their sisters, their younger ones, their elder persons, and even the community bond, that community bond that exists among them has been shattered by this ugly experience.
And finally, a conversation about Africa's economic future and a landmark gathering coming to the heart of Westminster this September. The African Economic Global Convergence, the AEGC, has been bringing together heads of state, finance ministers, investors and policymakers since 2015. From New York to Nairobi, it has built a reputation as one of Africa's most serious platforms for turning diplomatic ambition into economic outcomes. At its 2025 New York summit, held alongside the United Nations General Assembly, it reported over $250 million in investment interest and strategic partnerships. On the 18th and 19th of September, the AEGC comes to London for its 5th summit under the theme Unblocking Strategic Investments, Trade Partnerships and Sustainable Economic Growth across Africa and Europe. Makeva Tamofe is the founder and convener of the African Economic Global Convergence.
It's about one very simple but very, very important mission, which is about connecting development and also prioritizing with credible global capital, strategic partnerships, and building decision makers who have the capacity to move opportunities from conversations to execution. We created the African Economic Global Convergence because Africa does not lack the opportunities that we need to actually build what we have as Africa, which it is often missing. And for me, what is missing is the right convergence between government, investors, and also development partners, financial institutions, and the private sector. So the relationship that we have with the Invictus Games Foundation is a very significant relationship. To us, it reflects actually the kind of relationship and partnership AEGC believes in. Last year in New York, we recognized the great work and the amazing impact the Invictus Games Foundation have been doing for the past years. And the foundation, since then, though, the relationship between us has continued to develop, which it's developed through genuine engagement and shared conversations between us. And being in Birmingham for the 1 year to go countdown event was also very strategic for Prince Harry, an amazing young man, giving back to humanity and impacting lives beyond what a lot of people actually think. And it was a privilege for me to be there. The countdown was an important opportunity to see the Invictus community and also its mission at a very, very close range. And for us, and particularly for me, what I find very compelling about the Invictus is the work that is being done beyond sport. It is about the resilience, the recovery, and the dignity to rebuilding lives. And for AEGC, partnerships must have both economic value, human value, and human lives. For African development conversation, it's beyond capitalism. It has to do with also, it's beyond infrastructural development. We are very, very careful about that distinction at this moment, which we know the challenge after any investment summit, if we will say, is what happens when the lights go off, when everyone literally returns home. For AEGC, we follow through teeth to teeth on what happens next, what investments and what investors have committed in the room during the summit. We also encourage African stakeholders to come to the table with investment-ready propositions, clear project structures, and credible data, regulatory clarity, and defined commercial opportunities.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today, but as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.